Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the articles, the research, and the reports you've shared with us, and we try to distill that huge stack of source material down to what you really need to know.
And today's Deep Dive, it's all about fixing the foundation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're looking at what happens when the very systems we design, for science, for justice, for data, end up creating these perverse incentives or just amplifying our own biases.
Right.
Our mission today is to dig into three critical areas. First, the reward structure of scientific research. Then, how we regulate behavior and resolve conflict.
And finally, the huge challenges in just getting trustworthy data in the first place.
Okay, let's unpack this. So let's start with science.
Yeah.
We tend to think of it as this pure search for truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the sources you sent lay out this really compelling case that the career structure actually encourages, and I'm quoting here, rational scientists to adopt a research strategy that is to the detriment of the advancement of scientific knowledge.
That is a serious indictment, and it's because the whole system rewards volume and novelty.
So get papers out fast.
Get papers out fast. To get funding, to get promoted, researchers are pushed to conduct lots of small exploratory studies. And the key there is that they have low statistical power. They just need results, and they need them now.
What's the danger in that? In doing all these small, low-powered studies?
Well, the problem is statistical. If your study is underpowered, it can really only detect very, very large effects.
Okay.
So as the source material points out, the conclusions are highly likely to be wrong. It means most of what gets published is probably false. To get past that classic threshold, the p.05, the study has to find an effect that looks big.
But that doesn't mean the real-world effect is actually big or even there at all.
Exactly.
And that explains practices like p-hacking.
Right, where you have so much analytical flexibility that you can you can nudge the data until you find something statistically significant, even if it's completely meaningless.
So what's the fix? How do we get around that?
Well, the consensus on the statistical side, from researchers like Button and others, is moving beyond that simple significant or not binary. The community needs to demand high-powered studies, not just to find an effect, but to provide much greater precision in estimating the actual size of that effect.
Why is precision so much more important than just hitting that p-value mark?
Because precision is shown by the confidence interval.
Right.
If that confidence interval, the range where the true effect is likely to be, is really narrow, you can have a lot of confidence in the finding. But if it's super wide, your result could be anything from a huge effect to something totally twisted.
Got it. So it's about knowing how certain you are.
Yes. By focusing on effect size and confidence intervals, you can see if a finding is actually robust and important, or if it's just a statistical blip.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, changing the tools is one thing, but the whole, institutional culture has to change too.
Oh, absolutely. The research is clear on this. Raising quality requires collective action. You can't just ask individual scientists to be more virtuous.
Because the system rewards the individual, right? Getting the big grant, the solo author paper.
Exactly. It doesn't really reward the things that benefit the whole community, like sharing your code or building reusable tools.
So if we want scientists to adopt open research practices, like sharing their data, we have to actually reward them for doing it.
It has to be an explicit criterion for promotion, for tenure. But here's the catch.
What's that?
If only one university does it, it's seen as a tax on the scientist's individual career. It slows them down compared to peers at other schools.
So for the system to really shift, everyone has to move together.
They have to act collectively, otherwise you're just penalizing the innovators.
That makes perfect sense. And speaking of systems harming people, the sources show that the negative impact of all this isn't distributed equally, is it?
Not at all. And this point is brought home so vividly by the data from the COVID-19 pandemic.
What did it show?
Survey data showed a huge drop in the time devoted to research for female scientists, for people in the bench sciences, and especially for scientists with young children. The burden was completely disproportionate.
And that's not just a temporary dip in productivity. That lost time that can create career gaps that last for years, a decade even.
Precisely, which means leaders and funders need very targeted approaches to fix this. You can't just wait for the system to correct itself, because it won't. The system wasn't equitable to begin with.
This all leads to an almost philosophical question in the literature, which is, does eminence in science really reflect actual contribution?
Right. The ideal is that it should be directly proportional, strong consensus and peer evaluations. But the sources really question if we've ever attained that, especially in fields like psychology. science.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you don't always need to look at tenure rates to see the bias. Sometimes it's right there in how someone is introduced.
And this is where that study on internal medicine grand rounds is it's stunning. They analyzed how speakers, these leaders in their field, were introduced.
Okay, get this. The disparity they found when men were introducing speakers is it's shocking.
It really is.
Male introducers withheld the professional title doctor from female speakers 41.3% of the time.
Almost half the time.
But they only withheld it from other male speakers 24.3% of the time. I mean, that's nearly double the rate of professional erasure at the highest level.
And what just amplified this finding was the behavior of female introducers.
What did they do?
When women were introducing speakers, they used formal titles pretty much universally close to 100% of the time for both men and women.
Wow. So it suggests a totally different baseline standard for professional respect is being applied, specifically when men are introducing women.
It's subtle, but it's deeply corrosive.
Such a powerful example.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's pivot now from the lab and the lecture hall to the courtroom, the regulatory world, where the sources challenge another foundation, our whole concept of justice.
Specifically, restorative justice, or RJ.
Right.
RJ starts with this idea that we need regulation when obligations to each other, to the community, aren't honored, and that breach, it creates anger and hurt.
So RJ moves beyond just assigning blame and punishment.
Right, it moves toward healing, toward problem solving.
But you mentioned there's this intense debate inside the RJ community. Should it try to accommodate more traditional retributive values like, just deserts or fair punishment?
It's a huge debate. Many argue you have to, just to be pragmatic, because that impulse for retribution is so deeply ingrained. But the sources highlight this really powerful alternative view that those retributive values are now a hindrance. This perspective argues that retribution is, quote, corrosive of human health and relationships. It basically puts it in the same category as greed or gluttony.
That's a massive shift.
Yeah.
Treating the impulse for revenge as an unhealthy vice, not a necessary function of society.
Exactly. This school of thought says restorative justice has to be an explicit value shift away from that model. The focus has to be on reconciliation.
And this is backed up by some pretty solid psychology, right? The sources bring up something called reactance theory.
Yes, reactance is what happens when people feel their freedom is being limited. When you use deterrent threats, you will be punished if you do this. People see it as an attempt to control them.
And they push back.
They push back. They reassert their freedom by acting contrary to what you want.
It's like the teenage instinct. Tell me I have to do something, and suddenly I feel this urge to do the exact opposite.
It's precisely that. And this is the Hobbesian trap. When we design systems that treat people like knaves, assuming the worst, we actually make them more likely to become knaves.
So constant rewards and punishments actually get in the way of people internalizing positive values.
They inhibit it, yeah.
This raises an important question. If coercion doesn't work, how does RJ actually manage behavior without triggering all that reactance?
By always having a first preference for dialogue over coercion, instead of imposing rules from the top down, the focus, especially in transformative mediation, is on building the micro-foundations of a functioning democracy.
And that rests on two key values.
The first is empowerment, giving citizens a real voice, transforming them from these sort of weak, alienated recipients of justice into strong, constructive participants.
And the second is recognition.
Which is that deep acknowledgement and empathy for the hurt that other people experienced. It moves you from being self-absorbed in your own injury to being responsive to others.
The goal is to shift relationships from destructive to constructive, from alienating to humanizing.
Fostering what the sources call compassionately strong citizenship.
So what does this all mean? We've hit on systemic failures in science and how we think about justice. Now let's talk about the foundation of it all. Generating the knowledge itself. Data and survey science.
Yeah, the pandemic really forced survey researchers to change everything overnight. They had to move away from in-person interviews to these mixed-mode designs, mail, phone, web, all combined.
A huge stress test for data collection.
A massive one. And it led to some counterintuitive results, especially in one large national health survey.
Which one was that?
Called the FFS-CAHPS. That's Fee-for-Service Consumer Assessment of Healthcare Providers and Systems. It's a huge federal survey about patient experience.
Okay, so what was the surprising finding?
Well, contrary to what you might expect during the chaos of 2020, they saw a substantially higher rate of mail returns compared to 2019.
Wait, really? So people were more likely to fill out and mail back a detailed health survey during a national health crisis. That's fascinating.
It does, doesn't it? And that higher return rate was especially noticeable in the middle and southern regions of the U.S.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it suggests that in some places, people were more homebound or maybe just more focused on health topics, so they were more willing to fill out the paper form. It just shows how unpredictable people's behavior can be in a crisis.
So beyond just getting people to respond, we have to talk about the quality of the questions themselves. How do we make sure we're measuring what we think we're measuring?
Question design is everything. Psychometric research suggests that using more response options like 5, 7, or even 11 points on a scale generally gives you better quality data. It reduces measurement error.
It lets people be more nuanced.
Exactly, which is why efficiency can sometimes be the enemy of quality.
How so?
Well, researchers love agree-disagree questions. They're efficient, they're fast, but they can also increase the cognitive burden on the person answering and actually reduce data quality compared to item-specific questions.
There's always a trade-off.
Always a trade-off.
And finally, we have to talk about the ghost in the machine. Non-response bias. People don't respond because they're busy, they have survey fatigue, or they just think it won't make a difference.
And that bias doesn't just shrink your sample size, it can create totally misleading relationships between different variables.
Give me an example.
Okay, so surveys often find a link between being a victim of a crime and participating in politics.
Right, you'd think trauma might drive activism.
You would, but the sources suggest this might just be response bias. It might be that people who are more extroverted or, feel more efficacious are simply more likely to say yes to both questions.
So the correlation might be rooted in personality, not the actual experience itself.
It could be, yes. Which, this links directly back to our first segment on scientific integrity.
So
Because whether you're a patient or a policymaker reading medical literature, you are, quote, at the mercy of the quality of those trials and reviews.
the quality of the decisions we make depends entirely on the quality of the data.
It all does, which is why transparency in methodology, whether it's a huge national survey or a small lab study, is so crucial for anyone consuming that research.
This deep dive has really shown that the failures we see are often failures of support, of structure, of system alignment, not just individual effort. We saw that scientific integrity requires rewarding transparency and that justice requires relational healing, not just retribution.
And that to produce good work in any of these areas, organizations have to make sure their people have the resources and the support they need to actually hit their goals.
Yeah, we know from organizational theory that leaders are only successful if they ensure their followers have what they need. They have to build trust that they're there to support, not undermine them. That support element is just crucial.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought based on all of this. If we know that leaders have to provide support and remove barriers, what happens when an organization fails at something really basic, like internal communication? Say, when unit secretaries in a hospital routinely fail to tell housekeeping that a patient has been discharged.
That creates massive inefficiency, poor outcomes for the next patient.
Exactly. So is that just a failure of a basic communication system? Or is it a deeper failure of leadership support to make sure people have the training, the tools, the resources they need to do their part of the job? It's something for you to mull over.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into fishing the foundations of our systems. We hope you feel thoroughly informed.